ever-shrinking definition of who it considers to be a real American. I'm wondering if my next two guests qualify under that ever-shrinking definition. But brought to you by the Ten Commandments is Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, and Thom Hartmann, host of the acclaimed syndicated radio talk show, The Thom Hartmann Program. He's the author of the book, The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for being here. Tom, it's a remarkable trick that Donald Trump's got when you're trying to win an election and you're trying to appeal to the greatest number of people. He keeps shrinking it. He keeps on, anybody he doesn't like or doesn't agree with him, he basically tries to just push them out of the American tent.
Yeah, we're looking at the intersection of two strategies here, Ali. The first is this 40-year-long campaign by right-wing billionaires to denigrate American democracy. They see the government as the thing that regulates their oil refineries and reduces their profits and taxes them to give that money to poor people. So they're trashing, as you mentioned in your last segment, they're trashing public service, people who have jobs in government or, that sort of thing. And then on top of that, they're trying to suppress the vote of people of color, in particular, all across the United States. Ron DeSantis pioneered this in Florida back in 2022, I believe, when he was up for re-election, arresting a couple of dozen black people and parading them before the cameras. That caused voter participation in that 2022 midterm to drop from the 63% it had been 4 years ago in the previous midterm down to 54%. It just terrified people. And so now you've got Ken Paxton in Texas doing the same thing with Hispanics just this past week.
The indicted Ken Paxton. That's an interesting story. Christina, the Harrison-Walz ticket is being sort of positioned as a unifying force, certainly amongst Democrats, but they're trying to make that broader in contrast to Donald Trump's divisive campaign. Talk to me about how you think this is working, because what we've heard from and seen, particularly at the DNC, is a number of Americans who had come to, rightfully or incorrectly, think of people who are flying the flag or talking about patriotism as being exclusionary. And now Democrats are saying, you know what? Patriotism is a word that can be used for Democrats. The flag can be flown by Democrats proudly and reclaimed.
Absolutely. The Republicans kind of co-opted patriotism, but, so many Democrats would argue that providing health care for the citizenry, providing public schools for the citizenry is actually being quite patriotic, letting people choose what is best for them and their families. That is the true essence of American democracy. So as the Harris-Walz ticket tries to increase in a 50-state strategy the number of people who are able to participate. As Tom mentioned, Republicans have been systematically scaring people away from the polls, if not, legally pushing them out of the polls. The Harris-Walz ticket is saying, please reinvest in our country, reinvest in our values, reinvest into this collective action that we have. We've never been a perfect society. No one could argue that we have been, but we're working towards some ideals that have obviously been eroded, especially under the Trump era. And so as he tightens his tent and, tries to really drill down with really diehard loyalists, as we've seen, the Harris-Walz campaign is trying to present a different vision, saying, we aren't perfect, but together we can actually work on these things as a collective.
You've both written so many on so many topics. Tom, you've written extensively on the rise of authoritarianism, and one of the reasons why it's been difficult to watch people see the Republican Party co-opt these symbols like the flag is because they have started to become associated with Donald Trump's constant authoritarian talking about this stuff. At some point, this is starting to resonate with people that this is not. Our America is not his America, and his vision of America is extremely narrow and not something that the rest of us are prepared to give up.
If you look at the history of authoritarian regimes, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and a whole bunch of smaller ones, Orban's Hungary right now. One of the very first things they do is they wrap themselves in the flag. They project this hyper-nationalism. We are the true patriots. We are the only patriots. And at first, people are like, oh, yeah, patriotism. We're like well conditioned for that. We kind of respond to the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and all this sort of thing in a kind of Pavlovian response. I mean, throughout our childhoods, we were brought up to this. But then it reaches a point where the intensity becomes so great and the absurdity of their projection, and I think we saw this with the Arlington Cemetery event this last week, the absurdity becomes so unmistakable that people just get turned off by it and horrified by it. And frankly, I think we're at that turning point. I think it's a very significant turning point.
It's another turning point I'm interested in, Christina, and that is the degree to which Donald Trump, I mean, he's always thrown out Marxist and socialist and things like that. He's calling Kamala Harris a radical, calls her a communist. He said in that one of those clips that she's post-socialist, that her and Tim Walz have skipped socialism entirely. What Tim Walz has done in Minnesota is kind of amazing. He has done the things that Canadians like me think work, and people in sort of developed countries think work in terms of equalizing certain things. And he's made Minnesota attractive to business. It actually is working. There's nothing radical or socialist or communist about child tax credits, about universal health care, if that's the kind of thing we can achieve. These are mainstream in most other countries.
Right. Equality is good for business. We've seen it time and time again. Racism has been bad for business. You know, and as Donald Trump throws out these terms, socialism and, fascism and radicalism of Kamala Harris, what he's doing is A, dog whistling about her racial and ethnic background, but B, many of his believers don't actually even understand what those terms mean. So when he thinks about that, these are people who they use goods and services that they pay into. They use police and fire and public schools. So this idea that, some people could get a portion of the pie that have traditionally been excluded from it, all of a sudden Donald Trump's, supporters believe, well, then that means I must not be getting anything. That's actually not how democracy works. So instead of explaining that to people, he sort of obviously drills down on their basis emotions to say, we must continue to exclude others so that we can maintain our status as the true and real Americans, which is patently false. So, as Tom mentioned, I don't know. I hope that we're at a turning point. I hope that there's so many Americans that are exhausted by this exclusionary politic of Donald Trump. We've seen the data has not borne that out in past elections, especially with white voters. But I'm hoping that there's a segment of the population that is truly tired of this divisive politic and really wants to actually have goods and services equitable across the country for so many different types of Americans.
So in order for that to be the case, Tom, in order for more Americans to see this contrast and come to a conclusion about it and realize this is not a conversation about different policies, it's actually a conversation about democracy or the absence thereof. How do you handle that? Like we started the show by showing a split screen of what Kamala Harris and Tim Walz did this last week versus what Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did this last week. We've described how one group is trying to get more voters out and the other one is trying to stop more people from voting. But that involves the coverage of Donald Trump. You cannot achieve this goal without people seeing and hearing in Donald Trump's own words what Donald Trump does. So how do you handle that for the next 60 plus days?
Well, number one, I think Christina is absolutely right. And with regard to the press handling Trump, what they did in 2016 and to some extent in 2020 was they just said, OK, here's what Trump says, which it tends to normalize it. I think increasingly we are seeing, and I think it's a very good thing, we're seeing the press say, OK, here's what Donald Trump said, and here's why it's absurd.
Right.
Here's what Donald Trump said, and here's a comparison to what an actual patriot like Tim Walz might have, or Kamala Harris might have to say. I think that contrast is really important, and frankly there's not been enough of it. We saw some pushback with Kamala Harris's interview with CNN recently with Dana Bash. We need more of that, frankly, in my opinion.
Thank you to both of you. I appreciate having you here this morning. Christina Greer is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University, author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Tom Hartman is a radio talk show host of the Thom Hartmann program, a wonderful show that I once in a while have the chance to be on.